The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Richardson mansion, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. James Richardson stood in his study, his silver hair neatly combed and his expensive suit perfectly pressed. At 65, he had built his real estate empire from the ground up, and everyone in town knew him as a tough, sometimes ruthless businessman who always got his way. Today, however, something was different. For the first time in 20 years, Mrs. Chen, his trusted housekeeper, wouldn't be organizing his medication or preparing his morning coffee. She had finally retired, leaving him to interview new candidates for the position. The thought made him uncomfortable. He had grown used to Mrs. Chen's quiet efficiency and understanding of his particular ways. The doorbell rang precisely at 9 a.m. Richardson glanced at his Rolex watch. At least this one was punctual. He walked to the door, each step measured and deliberate, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the floor. Opening it, he found himself face to face with Angela Thompson, a black woman in her mid-40s, dressed in a simple but professional navy blue dress. "Good morning, Mr. Richardson," she said with a warm smile that reached her eyes. "I'm here about the housekeeper position." Her voice carried a gentle southern lilt, reminding him of his childhood summers in Georgia, though he quickly pushed those memories aside. Richardson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The employment agency hadn't mentioned this detail. He stood there for a moment too long before stepping aside to let her in, his movements stiff and reluctant. "You're on time." "That's something at least," he muttered, not quite looking at her. Angela noticed his reaction. She had seen it countless times before, but her smile never wavered. She had spent 20 years in this profession, working her way up from cleaning motel rooms to managing household staff at some of the city's finest homes. Each step of the way, she had learned to let prejudice roll off her back like water off a duck's feathers. "I brought my references," she said, pulling out a neatly organized folder. "I've worked for the Hendersons for 10 years, and before that, I've managed the Thompson household. I'd also have certification in first aid and elderly care." Richardson barely glanced at the papers. "Tell me why you left your previous positions," he said, his tone carrying an edge of suspicion. "The Hendersons moved to Florida for retirement," Angela replied calmly. "They'd offered to take me with them, but my children are settled in school here. They're both honor students, and I want them to finish their education in one place." Her pride in her children showed through, despite her professional demeanor. Richardson's eyebrows rose slightly. "You have children? I hope that won't interfere with your work schedule." Mrs. Chen was here every morning at 7 a.m. sharp, no excuses. "My kids are teenagers, Mr. Richardson. They can manage their morning routine, and I've never missed a day of work in my life." Angela's voice remained steady, though her hands clasped her purse a little tighter. He led her through the house, pointing out various rooms with minimal explanation. "The kitchen needs to be spotless. I have specific dietary requirements. The medications in my study must be organized by time and date. The silver needs polishing every Tuesday." His instructions came rapid fire, almost as if he was trying to overwhelm her. Angela took mental notes, occasionally asking practical questions that showed her experience. Each question seemed to irritate Richardson more, though he couldn't fault her professionalism. "Well," he said finally, standing in his study, "the agency vouches for you, and good help is hard to find these days." The way he said it made it sound like an accusation rather than an offer. "You can start tomorrow, 7 a.m. sharp." Mrs. Chen left detailed instructions about my routines. "Thank you, Mr. Richardson. I appreciate the opportunity." Angela's dignity in the face of his barely concealed disdain was its own kind of quiet strength. She thought of her daughter's dream of medical school and her son's passion for engineering. This job, with its excellent pay and benefits, would help make those dreams possible. As she left the mansion, Angela took a deep breath of the fresh spring air. She had dealt with all types of employers over the years, and she knew that sometimes the most difficult ones could surprise you. Besides, she had learned long ago that the best response to prejudice was excellence. Richardson watched her leave from his study window, already composing a complaint to the employment agency in his mind. But for now, he was stuck. Finding a new housekeeper would take time he didn't have, and despite everything, Her references were impeccable. Little did either of them know that this uncomfortable first meeting would be the beginning of a story that would change both their lives forever. Sometimes, the most profound transformations start with the smallest moments, even ones filled with tension and unspoken prejudice. The first few weeks at the Richardson mansion felt like walking on eggshells for Angela. Every morning, she arrived at exactly 6:55 a.m., giving herself 5 minutes to put on her apron and start the coffee maker before Mr. Richardson came downstairs at 7:15. She had quickly learned that he liked his coffee black with exactly 2 ice cubes served in the blue ceramic mug his late wife had given him years ago. But no matter how perfectly she prepared things, Richardson always found something to criticize. "The coffee's too hot," he would say one day, even though it was exactly the same temperature as yesterday when he had complained it was too cold. Angela would simply nod, make a mental note, and adjust accordingly, though she knew tomorrow would bring new complaints. One morning, while organizing Richardson's medications in his study, she overheard him on the phone with his daughter Linda. "The agency sent someone. Different," he was saying in the next room, his voice tripping with disapproval. "No, I'm not looking for anyone else right now. It's too much hassle. But I have to watch her like a hawk. You know how they are." Angela's hands paused briefly over the pill organizer, her heart heavy but her face composed. She thought about her own daughter, Tanya, who faced similar prejudices at her prestigious high school despite being top of her class. She had taught both her children that dignity and excellence were the best responses to ignorance. The tension peaked one Tuesday afternoon when Richardson came home early and found Angela listening to soft jazz on her small radio while polishing the silver. "I don't pay you to have a dance party in my house," he snapped, switching off the music with such force that the radio nearly fell off the shelf. "I apologize, Mr. Richardson," Angela replied calmly, though her fingers gripped the polished cloth a little tighter. "I find that music helps me keep a steady rhythm while polishing. It ensures I don't miss any spots." She demonstrated with the silver candlestick in her hand, which gleamed perfectly in the afternoon light. Richardson stared at the candlestick, trying to find fault but unable to do so. "Just keep the noise down," he muttered, turning to leave. But he paused in the doorway, watching as Angela carefully wrapped each piece in soft cloth. Her movements were precise and practiced, reminding him uncomfortably of how his wife used to care for these family heirlooms. The following week, Richardson's daughter Linda came to visit. She was taken aback by her father's constant nitpicking of Angela's work. During lunch, when Angela served them perfectly grilled salmon with asparagus, exactly as specified in Richardson's dietary requirements, he complained that the fish was dry, even though Linda could tell it was cooked to perfection. After Angela left the room, Linda confronted her father. "Dad, what's really going on here? Mrs. Chen didn't do anything different from what Angela does, but you never complained about her work." Richardson busied himself with his water glass, avoiding his daughter's eyes. "It's not the same," he said stubbornly. "Things just aren't done right anymore." Linda watched her father with growing concern. She had seen this behavior before, this resistance to change mixing with old prejudices he'd grown up with in the South. After lunch, she found Angela in the kitchen and apologized for her father's behavior. Angela was loading the dishwasher, each dish placed with careful precision. "Please don't worry about it," she said with a gentle smile. "In 20 years of housekeeping, I've learned that people can surprise you, sometimes when they least expect it themselves." Later that evening, while Angela was gathering her things to leave, she noticed Richardson standing in his study, staring at an old photograph. His usual stern expression had softened into something more vulnerable, almost wistful. She quietly continued with her work, but made a mental note of this rare moment of humanity. As she drove home that evening, Angela thought about the day's events. She thought about Richardson's criticism, Linda's kindness, and that moment of vulnerability in the study. In her experience, people who built the highest walls often had the most healing to do. She remembered her grandmother's words, "Hate is heavy. Let those who choose to carry it wear themselves out while you keep walking tall." At home, her children asked about her day, as they always did. "Just another day of doing my best," she told them with a smile, helping her son with his physics homework and listening to her daughter practice her college application essay. She didn't mention the difficulties. Instead, she focused on teaching them what she had learned over the years, that true strength lies in maintaining your dignity when others try to take it from you. The next morning, Angela arrived at 6:55 a.m. as usual, ready to face whatever challenges the day might bring. She had no way of knowing that soon everything would change in ways neither she nor Richardson could have imagined. It was during the third month of Angela's employment at the Richardson mansion when she made an unexpected discovery. While dusting the shelves in Richardson's study one quiet afternoon, she noticed a leather-bound photo album that had slipped behind some books. As she carefully pulled it out to dust underneath, it fell open and several old photographs spilled onto the floor. As she gathered them up, one photograph in particular caught her eye. It showed a much younger Richardson, probably in his 20s, sitting at a piano next to a black man in a jazz club. Both men were laughing, their hands on the piano keys, caught in what looked like a joyful moment of music-making. The photo was dated 1975, and on the back was written "Joe and me at the Blue Room, best night of music ever." Angela's hands trembled slightly as she studied the photograph. The carefree smile on young Richardson's face was so different from the stern scowl she knew. Before she could look at more photos, she heard Richardson's car pulling into the driveway. Quickly but carefully, she returned everything to its place. That evening, while cleaning around Richardson's extensive record collection, she paid closer attention to the titles. Hidden behind the classical music albums he usually played were dozens of jazz records. Names like Miles Davis, John Coltrane, and Duke Ellington filled the shelves. Some looked well-worn, especially one album by Joe Wilson and the Blue Room Band. The next day, Angela was polishing the grand piano in the living room, an instrument she'd never seen Richardson touch, when he came home early again. He stood in the doorway, watching her work with his usual critical eye. "Be careful with that piano," he said gruffly. "It's very old." "Yes, sir," Angela replied, then added carefully, "It's a beautiful instrument. Steinway Model B, isn't it? My father used to play on one just like it at the church where he was music director." Richardson's expression flickered with surprise, then something else, perhaps interest. "You know pianos?" "I grew up around them," Angela said, continuing her careful polishing. "My father taught me to play gospel and jazz. He always said music was the closest thing to magic we humans could make." Richardson stood there longer than usual, his stern facade cracking just slightly. "Jazz, you said?" His voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. "Yes, sir. I noticed your collection while dusting. You have some real classics. Joe Wilson's records are hard to find these days." At the mention of Joe's name, Richardson's face did something complicated, like he was remembering something both sweet and painful. Without another word, he turned and walked to his study, closing the door firmly behind him. Later that afternoon, while Angela was preparing Richardson's evening tea, she heard faint music coming from his study. The soft, melancholic notes of a jazz piano floated through the house, one of Joe Wilson's recordings. She smiled softly to herself but didn't mention it. The next few days brought subtle changes. Richardson still found fault with many things, but his criticism seemed less biting. Sometimes she caught him watching her with a puzzled expression, as if trying to solve a complicated puzzle. One morning, while serving his breakfast, Angela noticed him reading the local paper's entertainment section. There was a small article about the restoration of the Blue Room, the old jazz club from the photograph. Richardson's hands gripped the paper tightly, his coffee growing cold beside him. "Would you like me to warm up your coffee, Mr. Richardson?" she asked gently. He looked up, seeming almost startled to find her there. No, that won't be necessary." He paused, then added, "Did you know the Blue Room is reopening?" "Yes, sir. My brother's construction company is helping with the renovation. They're keeping all the original photos on the wall, I hear. Lots of history in that place." Richardson folded the paper carefully, his movements deliberate. "Yes, history," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Some things were different back then, simpler maybe. Or perhaps we were just younger and didn't know any better." Angela continued her work, giving him space with his thoughts. She understood that sometimes the hardest walls to break down are the ones people build inside themselves. Change, when it comes, often starts with small cracks in those walls. A shared memory, a piece of music, a photograph that reminds us of who we used to be. That evening, as she was leaving, she heard music from the study again. This time, it wasn't a recording. Through the barely open door, she glimpsed Richardson sitting at his desk, the old photograph in his hands, while Joe Wilson's jazz played softly in the background. His eyes were closed, and for a moment he looked almost at peace. Angela drove home that night thinking about how people are like those jazz records in Richardson's collection. Sometimes their most authentic selves get hidden away behind the things they think they're supposed to be. But the music is still there, waiting to be played again. The morning started like any other at the Richardson mansion. The autumn air was crisp, and fallen leaves scattered across the driveway as Angela pulled up at her usual time of 6:55 a.m. She noticed Richardson's bedroom light was already on, which was unusual. He normally didn't wake until 7:15. Inside, she began her morning routine, starting the coffee maker and checking the daily medication organizer. The house felt different somehow, heavier with an unusual silence. As she arranged Richardson's breakfast tray, whole grain toast, scrambled eggs with spinach, and his morning vitamins, she heard something that made her pause, a muffled thud from upstairs. Angela waited, listening. Richardson sometimes dropped things in the morning, but this sound was different. Then she heard it, a faint groan, barely audible but filled with pain. Without hesitation, she climbed the stairs, her heart racing but her mind clear. "Mr. Richardson," she called out. No response. The sound had come from his study, where he sometimes worked early in the morning. She knocked on the study door. "Mr. Richardson, are you all right?" Only silence answered. Angela took a deep breath and opened the door. The scene before her made her blood run cold. Richardson was on the floor, clutching his chest, his face ashen and contorted in pain. His morning coffee cup lay shattered beside him, dark liquid seeping into the expensive carpet. "Mr. Richardson." She rushed to his side, her first aid training kicking in automatically. His skin was clammy, and his breathing was shallow and irregular. Classic heart attack symptoms. She'd seen them before during her years working at Pine Valley Nursing Home. "Don't need." Richardson tried to speak, weakly waving her away even in this moment of crisis, but his words dissolved into a grimace of pain. "Sir, you're having a heart attack," Angela said firmly, already pulling out her phone. "I'm calling an ambulance and I'm going to help you. You can fire me later if you want, but right now, you need to let me help you." As she dialed 911, she kept her voice steady, years of experience helping her stay calm. "Yes, suspected heart attack. 1242 Oak Hill Drive. Patient is a 65-year-old male, conscious but in severe pain. I'm starting CPR." Richardson's eyes widened as another wave of pain hit him. For the first time since she'd known him, she saw raw fear in his eyes. The man who always seemed so in control was now completely vulnerable. "It's going to be okay," Angela said, positioning herself correctly as his breathing became more labored. "I'm right here with you." She began chest compressions, counting steadily under her breath, memories of her recertification class guiding her movements. Time seemed to stretch and compress all at once. She kept talking to him, her voice firm but gentle. "Stay with me, Mr. Richardson. Help is coming. Think about Linda. Think about your grandchildren. Keep fighting." In between compressions, she noticed the jazz record still on his turntable from the night before, Joe Wilson's last album. The morning sun caught the vinyl surface, sending little rainbows dancing across Richardson's face as she worked to keep his heart beating. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she continued CPR. Her arms were getting tired, but she didn't slow down. She'd learned long ago that sometimes the difference between life and death was simply refusing to give up. Through it all, Richardson's eyes stayed locked on her face. Something passed between them in those moments, something beyond employer and employee, beyond race and prejudice. Just two human beings, one fighting for life while the other fought to preserve it. She heard the distant wail of sirens growing closer. "Hear that?" she said, still counting compressions. "They're almost here. Just a little longer. You've got this." The paramedics burst in exactly 7 minutes after her call. They'd found Angela still performing perfect CPR, her voice steady as she briefed them on his condition and the time elapsed since she found him. "BP's dropping," one paramedic called out as they transferred Richardson to a stretcher. "We need to move now." As they rushed him out, Richardson's hand suddenly gripped Angela's wrist. His eyes, though clouded with pain, held a clear question: "Don't leave." "I'll be right behind the ambulance," she assured him, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "I'll call Linda on the way. You focus on staying strong." Standing in the doorway, watching the ambulance pull away, Angela let out a long breath. Her arms ached, and her uniform was wrinkled and stained with sweat. The morning sun had barely risen, and already the world had shifted on its axis. She quickly called Linda, locked up the house, and headed to her car. As she drove to the hospital, she thought about how life's biggest changes often come without warning, how a regular autumn morning could suddenly become the day everything changed. The broken coffee cup still lay in Richardson's study, the carpet slowly soaking up its contents. But for once, cleaning wasn't on Angela's mind. Right now, all that mattered was getting to the hospital, making sure Linda had support when she arrived, and praying that Richardson would pull through. Sometimes, she thought, it takes our darkest moments to finally see the light in others. The emergency room waiting area buzzed with the usual controlled chaos of a busy hospital. Angela sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, her work uniform still wrinkled from performing CPR. She'd been there for 3 hours, making calls and handling paperwork, while Linda drove in from out of town. The paramedic's words kept replaying in her mind. If you hadn't started CPR immediately, if you'd waited even 5 minutes longer, they didn't need to finish the sentence. Angela had seen enough in her years of work to know what they meant. A young doctor approached, his face showing the weariness of a long shift. "Are you the one who performed CPR, Mr. Richardson?" he asked, checking his clipboard. "Yes," Angela replied, standing up. "I'm his housekeeper. His daughter is on her way." The doctor's tired face broke into a smile. "Well, you did an amazing job. Your quick action and proper technique saved his life. The blockage in his heart was severe. Without immediate CPR, he wouldn't have made it to the hospital." Angela felt her eyes growing wet. Despite everything, despite all the harsh words and cold stares, the thought of Richardson dying had shaken her deeply. Will he be okay? He's stable now. They're preparing him for surgery to put in a stent. It's a common procedure, and his chances are good, especially given how quickly he received help. Just then, Linda rushed in, her face pale with worry. Angela filled her in on everything that had happened, keeping her voice calm and steady. The two women sat together in the waiting room while Richardson underwent surgery, their usual social barriers forgotten in the face of crisis. "He was lucky you were there," Linda said softly. "If it had happened when he was alone." Angela just nodded, remembering the fear in Richardson's eyes, so different from his usual stern expression. "Would you like some coffee?" she offered. "It might be a long wait." Hours passed slowly. Angela called home, telling her children she'd be late. Her daughter offered to cook dinner for her younger brother, and Angela felt a surge of pride at their self-sufficiency. She'd raised them to be strong and independent, just as her own mother had raised her. Finally, around sunset, the doctor returned with good news. The surgery had been successful. Richardson was in recovery, groggy but stable. When Linda went in to see him, Angela prepared to leave, feeling she'd done her part. But Linda caught her arm. "Please stay. He'll want to see you too." Angela hesitated. "I should probably go home and change first." She glanced down at her rumpled uniform, still bearing the evidence of the morning's events. "He won't care about that," Linda said firmly. "Please." When they entered the recovery room, Richardson looked smaller somehow, vulnerable in the hospital bed, with monitors beeping softly around him. His eyes opened slowly, focusing first on Linda, then on Angela. "The doctor said you saved my life," he said, his voice rough but clear. The usual edge in his tone when speaking to Angela was gone, replaced by something uncertain, almost humble. "Anyone would have done the same," Angela replied softly. Richardson shook his head slightly. "No, not anyone. You did." Even after, his voice trailed off, heavy with unspoken acknowledgement of his past behavior. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Linda squeezed her father's hand. "You should rest, Dad. Angela's been here all day, making sure everything was taken care of." Richardson's eyes widened slightly at this information. He looked at Angela again, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. "You stayed?" "Of course I stayed," Angela said simply. "I couldn't just leave without knowing you were okay." Another silence followed, but this one felt different. Richardson seemed to be struggling with something internal, decades of ingrained prejudice battling with the undeniable fact that this woman he treated so poorly had just saved his life. "I don't suppose," he started, then cleared his throat. "I don't suppose you know how to make that soup, the one Mrs. Chen used to make when I was under the weather." Angela smiled gently. "Chicken soup with ginger and mushrooms. Yes, I know how to make it. Would you like me to bring you some tomorrow?" "If it's not too much trouble," he replied, his voice carrying a note of genuine humility she'd never heard before. "It's no trouble at all," Angela said. "You focus on getting stronger. I'll handle everything else." As she finally drove home that evening, the sun had long since set. Her children were waiting up for her, worried after hearing about what happened. They hugged her tightly, and she held them close, grateful for their love and understanding. "Is your mean boss going to be okay?" her son asked. Angela thought about the look in Richardson's eyes when he'd asked about the soup, so different from his usual cold stare. "Yes, I think he is," she said thoughtfully. "Sometimes people just need a wake-up call to remember their humanity." That night, as she prepared the ingredients for tomorrow's soup, Angela thought about how life's biggest changes often come in unexpected moments. Sometimes it takes a crisis to break down the walls we build around our hearts, and sometimes saving a life means more than just keeping a heart beating. It means giving someone a chance to change their heart too. The hospital room felt different in the morning light. Richardson lay in his bed, staring out the window at a small bird hopping along the ledge. 3 days had passed since his heart attack, and for the first time in years, he had nothing to do but think. The TV droned quietly in the background, but his mind kept drifting back to those moments on his study floor. He remembered the fear, the pain, but most vividly, he remembered Angela's voice, steady, caring, professional, even after months of his cold treatment. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Angela stood there, holding a thermos container. The smell of ginger and chicken soup filled the room. "Good morning, Mr. Richardson. I brought you something better than hospital food." She looked different to him now. Had she always carried herself with such quiet dignity? Had he just never noticed before? She set up his meal with the same careful attention she'd always shown, but today he saw it for what it was, not servitude, but genuine care for her work and those around her. "The nurses tell me you're doing well," she said, arranging the soup bowl just so. "Your color is much better today." Richardson took a spoonful of soup, and the warm, comforting flavors brought back memories of his childhood, when his own mother would make chicken soup whenever he was sick. This is very good," he said softly. "My grandmother's recipe," Angela replied. "She always said good soup feeds the soul as much as the body." Richardson stirred his soup, struggling with words he'd never been good at saying. "Angela, I've been thinking." "You don't have to say anything, Mr. Richardson," she started, but he shook his head. "Yes, I do." He set down his spoon. "I've been lying here, thinking about that morning, about what would have happened if you hadn't been there. If you had been the kind of person He paused, shame coloring his face, "the kind of person I assumed you were." Angela sat quietly, letting him find his words. Through the window, they could hear birds chirping, the simple sound of life going on. "My daughter found some old photos," he continued, "from the Blue Room days. She brought them yesterday." He gestured to a small pile of photographs on his bedside table. "That's Joe Wilson there, the best jazz pianist I ever knew. We played together for years until..." His voice trailed off. "Until what?" Angela asked gently. Richardson's face tightened with old pain. "Until I chose my father's real estate business over music. Joe wanted us to go professional, tour with his band. But my father," he shook his head. "He had very strong ideas about what was proper, about who we should associate with. And I was too weak to stand up to him." He looked down at his hands, once skilled enough to play complex jazz pieces, now clutching a hospital blanket. "I gave up the music, took over the business, started becoming more and more like my father. It was easier that way, I thought, safer." Angela thought about the jazz records hidden behind classical music, about the piano that never got played. "It's never too late to change," she said quietly. Richardson let out a bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "At my age? After everything?" "My grandfather," Angela said, adjusting his pillows as she spoke, "learned to read at 65. said he was tired of pretending he could. My mother started college at 50, after all us kids were grown. Sometimes the hardest changes are the most worthwhile. Linda arrived then, bringing more photos and some clothes from home. She found her father actually talking with Angela, really talking, not just giving orders. She stood in the doorway for a moment, not wanting to interrupt this small miracle. Later that afternoon, as Angela was leaving, Richardson called her back. "There's a letter," he said hesitantly. "In my study desk, top right drawer. To Joe Wilson. I wrote it years ago, but never sent it. Would you mail it for me?" Angela nodded, understanding the weight of this request. Of course. That evening, while cleaning the study, Angela found the letter, yellowed with age but never sealed. She didn't read it, but as she slipped it into a new envelope, she noticed the address was for a nursing home in the next town over. Joe Wilson hadn't gone on tour after all. He'd stayed close by all these years. At home, Angela's children noticed she seemed thoughtful during dinner. "Is your boss still being nice?" her daughter asked. Angela smiled, thinking about the day's conversations. "He's learning," she said. "Sometimes people carry heavy things in their hearts for so long they forget they can put them down. But it's never too late to learn how to let go." The next morning, she brought fresh soup and found Richardson listening to jazz on a small radio his daughter had brought. His fingers moved slightly on the blanket, remembering old piano patterns. When he saw Angela, he didn't turn it off. "Joe Wilson's last recording," he said quietly. "From right before he retired." He paused, then added, "Thank you for mailing that letter." Angela nodded, setting up his breakfast. The music filled the room with memories of what was and dreams of what could still be. Sometimes, she thought, healing comes in many forms, not just in the mending of hearts, but in the opening of them too. 2 weeks after his heart attack, Richardson returned home from the hospital. The autumn leaves had mostly fallen, leaving the trees bare against the bright morning sky. Angela had arrived early to prepare the house, making sure everything was perfectly arranged for his return. As Linda helped her father through the front door, he paused, looking around as if seeing his home for the first time. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching dust motes in its beams. From somewhere in the house came the soft sounds of jazz piano. Angela had put on one of his old records to welcome him home. "I know it's not part of our usual routine," she said quickly, reaching to turn it off, but Richardson shook his head. "Leave it," he said softly. It's nice." He settled into his favorite armchair, looking tired but more at peace than Angela had ever seen him. The next few days brought subtle but significant changes to the household. Richardson started taking his morning coffee in the kitchen instead of his study, sometimes making small talk with Angela as she prepared breakfast. He asked about her children, actually listening to her answers. One morning, he cleared his throat awkwardly during breakfast. "I've been thinking," he said, setting down his coffee cup. "Your daughter, you mentioned she's applying to medical schools?" Angela nodded, surprised by the question. "Yes, she's been working so hard. Taking extra science classes, volunteering at the hospital." Richardson was quiet for a moment, fiddling with his napkin. I have some connections at the University Medical Center. People who owe me favors. I could make some calls if you'd like." Angela stopped what she was doing, truly stunned. "Mr. Richardson, that's very kind, but—" "It's not charity," he said quickly, his old gruffness returning briefly. Well, let's call it paying forward what I owe. She'd still have to earn her way, of course, but sometimes people just need a door opened for them." Tears pricked at Angela's eyes, but she blinked them away. "Thank you," she said simply. That would mean the world to her. A few days later, Angela arrived to find Richardson sitting at his grand piano, just looking at the keys. "I haven't played in 30 years, he said without turning around. "Probably forgotten everything." "Music has a way of staying in your fingers," Angela replied, setting down her bag. "My father used to say that." Richardson placed his hands on the keys, not pressing down, just feeling them. "Joe Wilson wrote back," he said quietly. He remembered everything. Said he's been teaching jazz to kids at the nursing home. He paused, then added, "I'm going to visit him next week." The transformation continued in small ways. Richardson started leaving his study door open while Angela cleaned, sometimes asking her opinion on business matters. He noticed when she seemed tired and insisted she take breaks. When her son needed help with a school project about local business history, Richardson spent an afternoon sharing stories and old photographs. One evening, as Angela was preparing to leave, she heard music from the living room, not from the record player, but from the piano. Richardson was playing, his fingers stiff but finding their way through an old jazz standard. He didn't stop when she appeared in the doorway, just nodded for her to stay. The piece wasn't perfect. 3 decades of silence had taken their toll, but there was something beautiful in its imperfection, in the effort to reclaim something long lost. When he finished, both sat in silence for a moment. "Life's too short for hate," Richardson said finally, his hands still resting on the keys. "I learned that the hard way, I suppose." He turned to face her. "Angela, I want to set up a scholarship fund for students who need a chance, like your children. Would you help me plan it?" Angela smiled, remembering her grandmother's words about how change happens, not always in grand gestures, but in small moments of choosing differently. "I'd be honored," she said. In the months that followed, the Richardson mansion became a different place. The jazz records came out of hiding. Joe Wilson visited sometimes, his wheelchair parked by the piano as he and Richardson played duets, their old rhythm finding its way back. Angela's children came by after school occasionally, filling the once quiet house with young energy. The scholarship fund grew, helping students who reminded Richardson of a young Joe Wilson or of Angela's ambitious children. He learned their names, their dreams, their struggles. Each story helped heal something in him that had been broken long ago. 1 year after the heart attack, Angela arrived to find Richardson and Linda in the kitchen, looking at old photographs. "Look what we found," Linda said, holding up a picture. It showed a young Richardson at the Blue Room, saxophone in hand, joy on his face. "Hard to believe that was me," Richardson said, but his eyes were bright. "I was so happy then, before I let fear and prejudice change me." He looked at Angela. "Thank you," he said, "not just for saving my life that day, but for helping me remember who I used to be." Angela thought about how far they'd come, from cold stares and harsh words to this moment of genuine warmth. "Sometimes," she said, thinking of her grandmother's wisdom once again, "it takes a shock to the heart to make us listen to it." Later that day, as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, the sound of piano music drifted through the open windows of the Richardson mansion. Inside, an older white man and a black jazz musician played together, while a housekeeper and her children listened, all of them part of something that transcended the boundaries they'd once thought so important. And in that music, in that moment, there was healing, forgiveness, and the simple truth that it's never too late to change, to grow, to become the person you were always meant to be.